Okay, so as you said, my name's Michiko. I am an authentication PM, so that's kind of my space. Dave used to be an authorization PM, so when we talk about DAC, we'll both be present to help out with that. This presentation is about securing authentication by protecting user credentials. It's kind of a timely topic. The first thing we want to talk about is, why do you want to protect user credentials? Why is that important? And why does it matter to you guys and not just to us, if that makes any sense? It's kind of one of those things that everyone needs to do the right thing. Talk about some best practices and some examples of things that we did in Windows 8.1 that are taking some of those best practices to heart. So, credential theft attacks. We are seeing more and more credential theft attacks become public over the past few years. And what that is it's an exploit in which the fact that there are some credentials cached on the system so that you can have single sign-on, that great experience that users like, where I type my credentials once, magic happens, I never have to type them again, right? Due to the infrastructure and how we build that, then attackers can take those credentials, grab them, take them off box, and attack systems. The most popular, widely publicized version of these attacks is what we call the hash attack. And here, what happens is an attacker targets a whole bunch of people, sends some kind of email often to them to see if he can get someone to do the wrong thing, which is really easy. I mean, we all get weird emails, open them up, things like that. And if he finds the right users, then he has a set of credentials. What he needs from that user is he needs to be admin. So it needs to be a user that has administrative privileges on a system, runs the malware, all the credentials for the system are harvested, and at that point, he has a bunch of credentials. Some may be local, some may be domain. He's then going to try and see if he can use those on other boxes. And at this point, you're just sort of harvesting from system to system, right? So you go to system, see if the creds you have, do they work, do they have privilege? If they have privileges, can you get more credentials? And you keep doing this over and over again, usually in automated form, until you can get domain admin. Now, once you have domain admin, then you can attack the domain controllers. Once you own the domain controllers, then you own the environment. So this is one of the reasons why people are so concerned about credential theft, right? It's one thing for me to steal your personal creds and have access to your stuff, but corporations are concerned when I steal your corporate creds and use that as a gateway to own the domain. We published a paper in December of 2012 on what this attack class was like and some mitigations you could do with the products we had at the time. Since then, we've shipped Windows 8.1, Windows Server 2012 R2. So this summer, TWC, Trustworthy Computing, will publish a new paper talking about kind of in the frame of today's environment and what those new features can do to help you out. So when we look at credential movement, which is the term we use, sometimes called lateral traversal attacks, things like that, you need to have three conditions, right? So when that attacker starts their attack and is trying to get, actually technically you need 4 conditions because you need to be admin on the box to get the creds, but you basically need 3 conditions for the credential for this to be useful. First, there has to be credentials on the box, right? So if there is absolutely no credentials on the box, when the attacker hits the box, there's nothing for him to get, right? So therefore, that's one thing you can do to try and mitigate it. A second is it has to be extractable, right? So for example, if I have a smart card, I have a credential, right? If I have a smart card in the reader, there's a credential there. You can use that private key on the smart card as long as I have it in the reader, but you can't take the key off the smart card, right? So if you have a non-extractable credential, then that's another way to mitigate the attack, because then at that point, I can still attack your environment. Don't get me wrong, but now I'm pinned to your system to attack your environment. So that's another thing that can be done. And the third one, which is one that is a place we've been spending a lot of time trying to innovate in, is, are they usable when they're off the box, right? So we kind of been working on all 3 things at the same time. But one thing that we've been experimenting with is, for environments with a lot of domain joined machines, can we make it so that if I extract credentials from one device, they're not usable on just any other device? That kind of thing. So properties that impact risk. So when you look at a credential, not all credentials are made equal. I mean, there is the privilege level, but I'm not going to talk about that. At this point, we're just going to assume a cred, right? Creds can have a long lifetime. Passwords have some password policy. Some passwords don't change. Some private keys have certificates that expire in 2 years. Some are less. So they're either short-lived or long-lived. We also have secondary credentials like tickets or tokens that also have shorter lifetimes. So obviously, a credential that has a long lifespan is more interesting than a credential that has a short lifespan. Second to that is also the key type, symmetric versus asymmetric, right? Symmetric keys are interesting because at that point you have two attack vectors. I can get the keys off the user, I can get the keys off the account database, right? Either one. Asymmetric is kind of a different beast. At that point, I can get the keys off the user, but usually the account database does not have something that can be stolen to be the user, right? It just simply has the trust anchor. So looking at kind of the credentials of interest, the first credential of interest is passwords. Passwords are interesting because they have a long life, and they are used in generating symmetric keys. They are usually protected in some way, but depending on how systems protect it, you can get clear text out of that. So getting the clear text password is typically what's interesting. And getting a clear text password is probably the most powerful cred kind of that class that you can get, because at that point you can attack pretty much any identity provider. So the thing about here is, we have several protocols that use passwords. We've got NTLM that most of you are probably familiar with. We've got Kerberos, Digest. There are also many IDPs, right? When you go to eBay or Google or us at Microsoft Services, you type in a password. A lot of times users, rightly so, don't want to remember a bunch of passwords, so they may have the same password. This is the thing that scares a lot of admins, right? Is the fact that perhaps my password here at Microsoft is the same as my Amazon password, right? And it's been known to happen, right? So that is something that's kind of concerning. But most of us that work in the industry are aware that clear text passwords, you don't want to disclose those. So we tend to be really as secure as we can be about those. Sometimes we can improve, but in general, that's something we look out for. The next thing that's interesting is, of course, any keys derived from that. So when you have a password, that itself is not interesting. You need to use it cryptographically. There's some key generation function that is used by the protocols in order to create a key which is used for authent. Typically, this is something that doesn't cross protocols unless two protocols use the same key. An obvious example of this would be NTLM and Curve, right? The RC4 key is the same for both protocols. So if you get the RC4 key, you can get both protocols. Again, we're seeing more and more account databases be stolen. We're seeing more and more kind of attacks on users to get their passwords. So what we're seeing is a lot of identity providers or IDPs, authentication services, are trying to put some kind of secondary mechanism. So just typing your password is not good enough. We have some kind of multi-factor thing that we want in order to authenticate you for the first time. Also, we're starting to see an uptake in private key-based, certificate-based authentication, right? So there's a desire that, hey, can I move away from this password thing to something else that is harder to steal? Now, ultimately, you want to access a resource, and the way most authentication protocols do this is they take that key to prove that you're you, and then they give you something that you will use then to get either authorization tokens or service tickets in order to access resources. In Kerberos, we call these ticket granting tickets, so I'm using that as an example. Pass the ticket attacks are attacks that focus on that particular object, right? So what they're trying to do is get the ticket granting tickets off a bunch of boxes so that they can go ahead and access the different resources. Getting that ticket is, again, a little bit more restrictive. So at that point, those things are personalized to that authentication service. So if I steal a Kerberos TGT for me, it's not going to necessarily work for your realms unless there's some kind of trust vector between the two of us, and it's definitely not going to work if you want to try and do Google or Apple or Microsoft services as far as getting access to resources. And they also tend to have a shorter lifespan. You're not going to see these things with a 2-year lifespan or 3-month lifespan. And the final thing, which is probably the least interesting thing, if it's the only thing you could collect off a box, you would have a very dull life, is service tickets. Because service tickets are special in the sense that it gives you access to individual resources, which means that you would have to really get lucky, right? I would have to find a user that's connected to what I actually want to go to in order to work my attack. And they also tend to be very short-lived, right? So like looking at OAuth, right, I think it's like 15 minutes. So they can have really short lifespans. So best practices. We have lots of different things now that we've heard that we should probably protect. What do we need to do to protect them? Our first word of advice is, if at all possible, don't get involved in that space. It's very complex, right? So just let the operating system mechanisms handle credential collection, let the operating mechanisms handle storage, and your life will be a lot simpler, right? What we have seen historically is every time we get one of these attack vectors, when Windows starts upping the bar, then the applications come into play, right? Right now, it's more interesting to attack Windows. Why would I waste time with a bunch of apps, right? I attack Windows, it's nice harvesting, I have a great time. But as we raise the bar, you start to see that more and more things are going for other applications. Do you have a question, Steve?
You have a contact the system administrator. I said, but I am the
system administrator, yeah. Yeah, so like I said, we'd like to offload the problem to us as much as possible, but you know, you'll have a different solution. And I assume you're pointing out that a lot of times our error messages are kind of cryptic, right, where we say, hey, it doesn't make sense, please contact you. Or
don't solve this problem.
Well, I mean, you're going to have... Yeah, exactly. So this is why the second slide exists. The first slide exists for hopefully, 80% of the people that can just say, I don't need to worry about this. I'm going to stop inventing my own stuff. You've now made it expensive. I'm out of this. And that's great, because if you can do that, please do that. If I could do that, I would do that. Trust me. Many of you guys in the room, I figure, are in the same position that my team is in, where we can't just punt the problem to another group, right? We have to handle credentials. Handling credentials involves more work. And ultimately, the way we like to think of it as far as our credential handling is, you only want to keep the credentials you need as long as you need them, and no longer. So as soon as you get to the point where at this point, like for example in Digest, we don't know whether you're going to use Digest as an operating system. Maybe you would use Digest. Maybe you don't use Digest. We don't know. So we're going to store the keys for you, right? That was our philosophy before 8.1, right? It was hey, we're going to be super helpful. We've got secrets, right? That turned out to be a bad philosophy, and so that's why we're changing it. So now at this point, we're going to say, hey, look, if you're going to use something special, you need to opt into that, and then we will be nice and we will store credentials for you for that. But we're not going to just have all the protocols aggressively say, I'm ready if you ever use me, which you may never use, right? So the first thing is, you never want to protect and persist credentials. We get dogged about this all the time, every time somebody stores a cred somewhere, right? We even get dogged for like our validator, which is not a credential, but like an authenticator that's used so you can log in when the network's down. Also, don't keep passwords, right? So most of us are keeping passwords in order to generate authentication keys. And so once you've created the authentication key, you don't need the password anymore. So you should just go ahead and get rid of it. The next thing is, don't keep long-term keys after short-term keys are received. So for example, now in Kerberos, once we have your ticket granting ticket, we get rid of the long-term key, right? We've got your ticket granting ticket. It's good for, well, normally it's 10 hours. You could configure that to something else. And the idea is that you're probably going to set that period for something that makes sense for your users. Where I work, we lock all our desktops. So when we unlock, we get a new ticket granting ticket. So 10 hours is way more than I need. I don't think I've ever been at my desk for 10 hours straight. I always have to go somewhere in that period of time and then unlock to come back. And also, when you clear the credentials, it's important that you clear the credentials with a secure memory function. An example of this is the secure zero memory, right? So just a quick erase of it's not going to be sufficient for something like this, because that credential has great value, maybe not yours, but a domain admin or maybe an executive in your company, and so somebody's going to try and get that. The next thing is just something not so much about protecting credentials, but just kind of a piece of advice from what I'm seeing now is A lot of pain I have in my space is due to this assumption that there's always going to be password sign-on. Windows is a pretty old operating system. It's been around for a really long time. We have a lot of APIs. We have a lot of UIs. We have a lot of things that flow credentials. A lot of those things are broken now that we're moving away from passwords, right? And so especially as we look at multi-factor, you start to box yourself in when you assume that the credential that you're going to need is just a username and password, right? So I can give you an example of this. You can now log on with a Microsoft account. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that with 8.1, but you can have a Windows device, log on with a Microsoft account. Sometimes Microsoft accounts need multi-factor auth, right? If you just use Logon UI doesn't have any, hey, I'm getting an interrupt and I need to do something with it mentality, right? So that had to be built in for this. So that's something to keep in mind just to future-proof what you're building. The other thing is that we do envision a future where users won't have passwords. There will be no symmetric keys. We know this is hard. We know that we're not there yet, at least for like 99.999%. On the other hand, it could be that the user has a password, but they may not even know it, right? So in the case of smart card only, those users all have passwords that they have absolutely no idea what it is. Right. It just, we do magic and things work. And then, as I already, I think, beat the dead horse, passwords may require another step. So some kind of multi-factor auth. So examples of what we've done in Microsoft with these philosophies in mind, except for that multi-factor warning. Credential effective availability. So the first thing we did is we looked at the system and we said, hey, where are we keeping credentials available when we don't need to? One of the most interesting things that we did was this restricted admin mode for remote desktop connection. And the reason I call it interesting is that we didn't do a great job communicating what the purpose of this feature is, and so people that wanted to protect the other endpoint don't like the feature. So the purpose of this feature is if I have a trusted client and I am connecting to an untrusted host, there are there are a few scenarios in which the case is I have an untrusted client connecting to a trusted host. That is not what this feature is designed for, right? This feature has the idea that perhaps I'm connecting to a device that is untrusted. This was new for Windows 8.1 and Windows Server 2012 R2. We did make it available for backport. It is a two-phase process. So we've got the patch out for server that came out in May. In the summer, you'll see the client. So how it works, this is really the scenario for which this was designed. I work at a help desk. My job is to fix users' computers. I have a workstation that is managed and that I am meticulous with. So I know it's clean, doesn't have malware, I do the right thing. However, I talk to a lot of users. That's not necessarily the case, right? So a common thing that'll happen is users say, wow, my machine's really flaky, it's doing weird things, right? Typically at this point, we would recommend that you use some of our great features that do what used to be called terminal service shadowing, right? The idea that you do kind of an over-the-shoulder remote desktop connection to the user, and so you're logged on as the user, and that user's logged on, you're watching them do stuff. That's what you should do. However, what we learned is that there are a lot of help desks that actually just, they need to go and they need to connect to the desktop as themselves, and they need to do some things. The problem with that is that you pass your credentials to that device. So what you should do is, if you have one of the systems, the clients that support this, you'll do a remote desktop in restricted admin mode. It's a command line command. You do that on your workstation. What that happens then is that the help desk connects to the user's device without sending the help desk credentials. So for those of you that aren't familiar with CredSSP, which is what's used in this connection, CredSSP has a TLS outer layer. Inside of it, it uses NTLM or curb for network auth. So in other words, we authenticate the user on that user's device using NTLM or curb. So that device knows who you are because of either NTLM pass-through or a curb or a service ticket. And so it can check there to see whether or not you have access. And at that point it says, hey, I know who you are. I'm going to give you admin access. And at this point is usually where the data payload in CreditSSP, which is your username or password or a handle to your smart card happens. In restricted admin, there's nothing there, right? So we create a desktop just using the information we got from the network logon. You now have admin privileges, so you can do whatever you want as admin on that box. But then when you connect to tool servers and other things, you cannot connect as yourself because you don't have any credentials for that system to use. Instead, you'll connect as the actual user's device, that host, in order to make those connections. So it provides a secure way for me to manage a system that's possibly owned, right, in order to kind of see what's on there, do any setting changes, that kind of thing, without exposing my raw credentials to that machine. Okay. Any questions? Yes?
The help desk workstation not send the credentials to the user device. You can use KCD for that, right? You can just send forwarding input on behalf of the workstation.
So the question is, why can we use, I'm going to paraphrase, why couldn't we use other Kerberos technologies like forwarded tickets or constrained delegation to connect to the help desk? You can, that requires more configuration, right? Because the bottom line is when you do that, you're still sending a credential to the device, so that device has to be trusted, right? In order for that device to make outbound connections as you, it will still have the power as you. So even if I gave it a ticket, it could still use that ticket to attack the tool server. Yep. Right. Right. So, I mean, that's the main reason that we chose to do it this way is you pretty much authenticate twice to the device, a network auth, and then you do a credential one. What we want to do is protect the tool servers from the user's device, and using any kind of ticket-based thing is not going to work because that ticket could then be used to connect to arbitrary servers as you by someone that's not you.
But I mean, 4 is okay. 2 errors would avoid sending over the CreditSSP the administrator credentials.
Right, we don't. Yeah. So the way it works, we don't really have whiteboards. I guess we do have whiteboards. Am I allowed to use whiteboards?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know how easily you can see that. So when you look at the protocol, right, CreditSSP, you've got TLS, and you've got inside of that you've got a channel which is either curb. How's that? All right. And I have the worst handwriting known to man, so I apologize. And then inside of here is usually your username, password. Right? And what happens is this username and password goes into Logon UI, just like it does if you just logged onto the desktop, and the whole process goes as normal. What we did is we created, so CreditSSP already had a version that would do this. All right, that would create a TLS channel. Oh, thank you. That would create a TLS channel with curb or NTLM with nothing in it, right? So we already had that in CreditSSP. What we did is we built a way that a remote desktop client would use this, and then second, that when WinLogon, actually more importantly terminal service, when terminal service got this information, what comes out of this is a curb ticket or basically an NTLM net logon blob, right? I'll call it a structure. And then that's what's used to generate a access token for which we do network authentication, right? We check and see, oh, okay, you're doing a network connection. I've created an NT access token, yes or no, are you allowed to access? So we already have created a access token. Now, I'm not going to get into the complexities of that access token. It's not necessarily the same as the access token you would have got if you logged on interactively, but it's very similar. And so, we did the magic to give you an interactive logon token, and that's what we use to start WinLogon. So it's a credless, well, it's not a credless logon. It's a ticket-based logon. Oh, another question. Yep.
First, I'm glad to see that a large company is being dried up white markers.
I think it's because we're not supposed to use whiteboards. That's why I asked permission first.
So I don't know a good place to bring this up, so I'll kind of grasp it in
Sure.
the sense. We talk about not storing credentials, but the one thing that really hasn't been mentioned is the need to store the machine account and password, which is always going to be needed to generate the TPT. I mean, that's how you define the cryptographic information itself.
Correct, and service passwords as well, right? Unless you have group managed service accounts, right? And even then, we cache those, right? So for convenience sake.
Is that the whole discussion, or is there something interesting you guys are looking at that project?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the machine has to know its CRUDs, right? And it has to get it in some way. And to be honest, maybe you guys can think of a better way. The only way I can think in which you can do that securely is if it's a private key, right? Specifically, a hardware-bound private key, right? So if a machine could use a hardware-bound private key, right? And it has credentials, but they're non-exportable. It comes back to that kind of three principles. We can't get rid of the existence of a credential for services or machines, but maybe we can try and make it hard to get off or make it so that you can't use it from another device. For services, you could do the binding. For machines, they are them. You can't really stop them from doing their thing, right?
It's primary attack. Once I have a machine account and I have certain permissions based on the configuration to be able to start exploring.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I mean, is this kind of blue sky thinking about what possibilities were? There's some things.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, machine creds, they're going to be on the machine. We're looking at various possibilities, and yeah, it is a good attack vector. Reduced credential footprint. So I said we don't store creds unless we need them. I'm not going to beat this one up, but basically we took out creds that we didn't need after we didn't need them. We also have this available for down-level systems back to Windows 7. We also have a new concept called Protected Users Group. The Protected User Group is a new built-in group, and what that does is it controls some things. So it's kind of a way, there are many different ways to look at it. We look at it as a way that it applies different credential policies just simply by having membership. So the way that works is if I'm a protected user and I log onto a system, then the same thing happens as it happens and has always happened. The LSA gets the credentials, authentication packages get the credentials, and we log onto the domain. Once we've logged onto the domain, that DC says, oh, you're a member of protected users. It puts the protected users group via the SIDS into the ticket or the NTLM structure, comes back to the machine. The machine then sees that and now applies some policies to that. If you're on a machine that's patched, because it is backported, or Windows 8.1 or higher system, NTLM no longer caches the password. So basically broken NTLM. Digest doesn't cache the password anymore. CredSSP doesn't cache the password. Kerberos doesn't cache the password or long-term keys once it has the ticket granting ticket. And a cached logon, in other words, offline verifier, is no longer created. So that machine has mainly short-term kind of credentials on it for that user. But it also does mean that that user may have services that they can't use because they require things, say, like NTLM. So that's why we didn't do it for everybody. Credential extractability. This is a hard space. So the one offering we have here is LSA protection. What we did is we made an option to make the LSA protected process. It is not perfect. It is kind of our first attempt in the space. It is also very problematic because now all your plugins have to be protected processes. So if you have any custom SSPs, if you do this on domain controllers and you have password DLLs and things like that, it could be a problem. Credential usability is where, I think I had the most fun. It was the idea of, is there a way we can make a credential not useful from another machine? So the first thing we did was a pretty simple fix, which was the idea that if you look at our best practices doc, it says what you should do is make sure that administrators in the SAM, the local account database, can't log on from the network, right? Just make them so that they can only do interactive logon on the machine. can't connect from the network. This stops that kind of traversal where everybody has the same local admin account password, and I just pop machine. The problem with this is the best way to do this is with this user rights assignment, deny access to this computer from the network. When you apply it with group policy, though, it resolves the name typically to a SID if you're not careful. That SID is different on every machine. So we did the easiest of possible solutions with probably the longest name of a group we have in Windows, which is we created the local account and member of administrators group. So basically, we have a well-known SID that is in the token for every local account that is also a member of the administrators group. Right? So if those two conditions are met, you have the SID, and now you can apply that well-known group that's universal, known throughout the forest, to say, hey, you can't log on from the network. So the great thing about that is twofold. First, when you try to do the administrators thing, and what people would do is they put administrators in there, and they would make sure that the name doesn't get resolved. That only blocks the accounts named administrators. With this, it blocks any account that is in the administrators group. So if you create your own account and make it administrator, right, in the local account database, the SAN, it will not be able to log on from the network. Protected users. So the first part of protected users is kind of interesting. We make sure the clients don't have as much information. The second part of protected users, once you get your domain controllers up to 2012 R2 and DFL, is actually the most interesting. At that point, these protected users have domain-side protections. So the literal pass the hash attack, which is typically about the NTOWF, is not going to work for these users because NTLM doesn't work. And RC4 Kerberos doesn't work. These users that are protected are only AES logon users and, of course, PKNet. So if they're using a private key, they can still log on. They can't be delegated anymore. We pushed out this guidance for years and years and years that delegation is dangerous if you're a high-value account, so we automatically turn that off. And we give you a shorter TGT because that was the communication that we heard, is that 10 is a little long, so we picked 4. Knowing that it would probably not be what you want, which is why we built authentication policies so you can make your own number for that and apply them. So how NTLM fails, pretty straightforward. You log on with NTLM to a server. For those of you that didn't know this, for NTLM what happens is then we pass that through from that server to the domain controller. That domain controller sees that the user is in the protected users group. It then fails the authentication call. Simple. Active Directory authentication policies and silos. So this is our first foray into trying to do some kind of isolation. It does require that the domains are Windows Server 2012 R2. It is a forest scope. So the idea is that you would create an authentication policy at the forest level. You could apply it to any users in your domains, and any computers in your domains, or any managed service accounts in your domains. Also, you can create silos, which give a way of kind of grouping them. And the thing that we're doing here is we're building on the dynamic access control model, which you'll hear about shortly, with the idea that you can have that kind of rich expression granularity on control for auth-n. So the silos are actually pretty simple. Most of the power is in the policy. So a silo, all that is when you create a silo, that creates a new claim, a new well-known claim in your forest based on the silo name, which is then injected during logon. So when we talk about dynamic access control, we talk about claims, we talk about putting claims into user logons or computer logons. That's all Silo's doing, is it's creating a well-known claim for you to have on all these users that are a member of the silo. And then other things that are aware of claims can do access control based on that. So when Nir's talking about file servers, this could apply to file servers. You can say file servers consume the silo claim. For auth-n, we've enlightened the KDC to use it. So the KDC can do it. Now the problem was, this was like the hardest thing to design, is it's a security feature. So we had the problem that we couldn't make the silo very easy to deploy. Because we had the problem that if you're creating silos and you're trying to basically create these isolation containers, you needed to ensure that if one container got breached, it couldn't then breach all the other containers. So this is like I get feedback on this, and when we were designing it, we had this problem that you need mutual agreement on the silo, right? So the silo owner has to say, I want that object in my silo. And the owner of the principal, aka the user, the service, or the computer, has to say, I want to be in that silo. And the reason you need that is because if you don't have both of them agree, that becomes a breach point to start cracking silos all the way across. So it is not the easiest thing to configure, I'll be honest. 2 steps. First, silo owner says, hey, you can join my silo. Then people who own the principal say, okay, I'm joining the silo. So that's what a silo is. Now, where we can use the silos in Auth-N is we can use them when issuing ticket granting tickets. So one thing we do is if you have the domain controllers that understand this, they will use dynamic access control. So how it works is, let's say I've configured a policy saying that this user can only log into device 1, right? So they can only do their sign-on from device 1. So then they will enter the creds on device 1, and a armored Kerberos authentication request is sent. So we use compound authentication. The domain controller then looks at the policy, sees that they're restricted to that device. It notices the armor, the compound identity armor, meets those conditions, and it then replies with the standard armored reply. How it fails is if I log on from another device, then it would be armored with that device, or it would not be armored. Either one, doesn't matter. At this point, it's going to see the authentication policy, see it needs to be device 2. If it's unarmored, it's going to fail because it's not armored. I don't know what device you're coming from. If it is armored with the wrong device, then it's going to fail because that's not device 1. Yeah, it's the compound auth work. So the question is, what does armored mean? And when we use the term Kerberos armoring, it's based on our extension of Kerberos armoring, where you have compound authentication, and it's armored with the machine's ticket granted. Another thing we figured that people want, because people ask me this all the time, is that apparently not enough services are enlightening themselves with claims, so would it be possible at the Auth-N layer to enlighten them with claims? So we have a Auth-N option that you can, on the services account, right, where the SPN would be registered, you can say, with an authentication policy, what conditions need to be met, right? Those conditions are rich expressions. So it could just be about a complex expression about the user. It could be a complex expression about the device. It could be a complex expression about both of them together. It doesn't matter. But that's why the second part of the slide is so complex, because depending on what you build the rich expression, then different requirements need to be met, right? If you're just interested in having a rich expression with user groups, then you're golden. You don't have anything exciting to do. If you have user claims, because of the fact that resources and users can be in different domains, you need to make sure that the user's domain has DAC. Yes? So the question was, does this have any effect on the size of the TGS response? So it is an armored response. So yes, it would make it the size of an armored response, right? An armored response is always bigger than a non-armored response because it has the armor granting ticket with it. So yes, it's going to be bigger. And it's also, since it's compound auth, if you're armoring and doing, so if you're going into the part where you do device claims and groups, right, that's where you get the armoring, then the service ticket is going to include the device properties. If all you're doing is user groups, it's not going to be any bigger. It's going to be the exact same size. If you're doing user claims, it'll be a little bigger because it's got user claims in it, right? Whereas before it wouldn't have any user claims. So it depends. So how it works is that the application wants to authenticate to SPN1. I have these nice, very product-specific examples here. So I send a compound authentication service ticket request to the domain controller. The domain controller looks up SPN1, sees that that's the finance server, and sees that there's an authentication policy. Since both the user and the device, in this case they had a user and plus device expression, is met, they'll go ahead and issue the reply, and then you can now connect to the finance server. These slides are remarkably similar to DAC slides because that's all it's using. It's dynamic access control. How it fails with the wrong device is, let's say I'm on a device that's not financed. Then I go ahead and try and connect. I get an authentication request. We look it up. The device is not a member of finance. In this case, we used a silo, so we're using the embedded claims. And then it fails authentication. And then we have information about all these technologies on our TechNet, and we expand this as we get more and more information. And that's it. And I think I ran a little long because I wanted some Q&A, but I think we did our Q&A during the presentation. So are there any more questions? Because there is also a Q&A in 45 minutes, is it? All right, you guys are really quiet. So hopefully we answered all your questions.